On the morning of May 19th, 2007, the Ellison household in Stewart County, Tennessee moved at the slow, familiar pace of a family settling into a weekend they'd been looking forward to. Mark Ellison, 47 years old and known in town as the kind of father who rarely let go of his son's hand in crowded places, was packing 2 fishing rods, a tackle box, and a small cooler at the back of his pickup. His son, 12-year-old Tyler, lingered by the kitchen table, finishing a bowl of cereal and barely saying a word. That was normal for him. He wasn't shy exactly, just quiet, observant, the kind of kid who listened first and spoke only when he had something meaningful to say. It was one of the many traits Mark always admired about him. He used to tell family friends, "If you give that boy a minute, he'll tell you everything you need to know." That morning, the plan was simple: a short afternoon trip to the old Harpeth Bend dock, a place they'd visited dozens of times. They weren't planning to take the boat out. They just wanted a few solid hours on the water before a predicted storm rolled through later in the evening. For them, fishing wasn't about catching anything. It was a ritual, an excuse to talk, to rest, to step away from the noise that had crept into their lives over the past year. This trip, Angela remembered later, was Mark's idea of resetting Tyler's mind before the boys' end-of-semester exams. Around 11:40 a.m., the pair said goodbye. Angela stood at the door, watching them walk toward the truck. She remembered how the morning sun reflected off the hood, how Mark gave a playful nudge to Tyler as they climbed in, and how her son's laugh, quiet but unmistakable, followed them down the driveway. It was the last clear moment she ever had of them. The drive from their house to Harpeth Bend took just under 20 minutes. A couple living along the route later recalled seeing Mark's truck pass by around noon, moving slowly, almost cautiously, as if he wasn't in any hurry to get anywhere. Nothing about that was unusual. Mark was always a careful driver, especially when Tyler was with him. But when investigators reconstructed the timeline later, that slow pace stood out, not because it suggested anything troubling, but because it represented the final, predictable detail in a story that would soon lose its shape. When the pair pulled into the gravel lot by the dock, nothing indicated danger. The weather was warm, the sky clear, and the lake, according to 2 teenagers who were skipping rocks near the launch point, was calm. They saw the Ellisons only briefly. Mark carried a tackle box. Tyler carried a folded life jacket. Neither looked upset or rushed. They looked like a father and son doing what they always did. From that moment on, every timeline estimate relies on gaps and educated guesses. According to the state investigator, who later reviewed the case, Mark and Tyler likely set up along the far railing of the dock, the same place they favored every year. They probably cast their lines, opened the cooler, and settled into the quiet. Nothing points to anyone being nearby. No suspicious vehicles, no unknown boats, no raised voices or signs of struggle. Whatever happened did so quickly and without witnesses. By early evening, when the predicted storm began to press into the county, Angela started looking at the clock more often. Mark usually texted before bad weather rolled in, especially if Tyler was with him. When she didn't hear anything by 6 p.m., worry began to tighten in her chest. It wasn't panic, just that uneasy awareness that something wasn't aligning with the routine she knew by heart. At 7:10 p.m., she tried calling her husband. No answer. At 7:12, she called again, straight to voicemail. 30 minutes later, she drove toward the lake herself. Along the way, she passed a sheriff's cruiser, heading in the opposite direction, and she later recalled wishing she'd flagged it down. When she reached the dock, the parking lot was empty except for Mark's truck. Rain had just begun to fall in thin, uneven sheets, dampening the gravel, but not enough to wash anything away. The truck's doors were locked. The cooler sat in the back, still full. One of the life jackets was missing, the one Tyler had carried, but the second was lying dry inside the truck bed, as if no one ever touched it. What unsettled her most was the truck's position. Mark always backed into spaces. It was a habit everyone in town knew about him, but tonight, the truck was angled strangely toward the water, crooked, as if he'd turned too sharply and never bothered to straighten out. That wasn't him. That wasn't how he parked. It was the first sign that something was wrong, but she didn't need logic to tell her that. She already felt it in her stomach. She called 911 at 8:04 p.m. Her voice, according to the dispatcher, broke mid-sentence. Deputies arrived minutes later. They walked the length of the dock, shining flashlights into the lake, calling out Tyler's name first, then Mark's. There were no fishing rods leaning against the railing, no bait bucket, no sign of a struggle, no footprints that could be traced. Everything was too still, too untouched. By midnight, search crews expanded outward, sweeping the shoreline and radioing each other with updates that amounted to nothing. No ripples on the water, no clothing, no gear, no sign the pair had gone into the water willingly or accidentally. The only physical clue at the scene was the missing life jacket, something investigators would obsess over for months. If they had drowned, where were their belongings? Their rods? Their tackle box? Their cooler was still closed, still packed. Most accidental drownings left behind at least some trace of disorder. Here, nothing was out of place except for the people who should have been there. Angela stayed at the dock the entire night. She stood beneath the awning of an old picnic shelter, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the flat, black water, as if willing an answer to form. Searchlights swept in arcs. Deputies moved back and forth with quiet urgency. The rain slowed, then stopped, leaving behind a cold breeze that carried the scent of wet wood and soil. Even rescuers later admitted the lake felt unnaturally silent. Not dangerous, just wrong. By dawn, the search intensified. Marine units were brought in. A small rescue boat dragged sonar equipment across the surface, mapping the underwater terrain. Divers went in twice that morning, surfacing with the same emptiness they entered with. The lake bed was thick with silt, fallen branches, and debris from decades of storms. But it did not give up anything belonging to Mark or Tyler. Not a shirt, not a shoe, not a single bubble trail suggesting fresh disturbance. The sheriff gathered the family by noon and gently told them the working theory was an accidental drowning. Maybe the boy slipped. Maybe the father dove in after him. Maybe the storm wind had caused them to lose footing. These were explanations that allowed the moment to make sense on paper. But even he admitted privately later that nothing actually supported that version of events. The cooler, the parked truck, the untouched gear, the missing jacket, it all formed the outline of a scenario, but none of the pieces locked together. As afternoon shifted into evening, volunteers divided into grid patterns along the shoreline, calling for the pair every few minutes. Some of them knew Mark personally. A few had coached Tyler at school or seen him at church on weekends. For them, this wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a search for a family they had watched grow up. Yet every sweep ended the same way, calls echoing back in silence. Investigators returned to the dock over and over, re-examining the same details, hoping something would reveal itself if they stared hard enough. One deputy noticed small scuff marks near the far railing, but they were too faint to identify. Another pointed out a broken board along the left edge of the dock, but it appeared weathered, not freshly damaged. The more they looked, the more the scene felt like an empty stage. Whatever had happened had occurred quietly and quickly, leaving no trace for them to chase. As darkness fell again, 24 hours after the pair had left home, the emotional weight on the search widened. Angela's hands shook uncontrollably. Family friends tried to steady her, offering reassurances they themselves no longer believed. The sheriff approached her gently, explaining that they would continue searching through the night, but that the lake, especially near the deeper channels, was unpredictable. If the pair had drowned, recovery might take days. It was the closest he came to acknowledging just how little sense the situation made. What no one realized yet was that this moment, the first day, the first night, the first haunting silence, would set the stage for 11 years of unanswered questions. 11 years of explanations that shifted, theories that collapsed, and searches that turned up nothing. 11 years in which the lake would hold its secrets so tightly that even the most seasoned investigators would eventually stop trying to pull them free. But in those first hours, no one knew that. All they knew was a father and son had vanished on a dock they trusted, on a day that should have been ordinary. And as the second night closed in, a deputy made a quiet admission over the radio, a line later recorded in the case log. It was short, nearly whispered, but it carried a weight no one wanted to acknowledge. Nothing adds up out here. It was the first hint that this wasn't going to be a simple drowning, and it was the first sign that the truth, whatever it was, had sunk somewhere deeper than anyone expected. By the second day of the search, the hope that Mark and Tyler were simply lost somewhere along the shoreline had faded into something heavier, something far more complicated. The lake had been combed so thoroughly that morning that even the sheriff admitted privately the chances of finding them alive were extremely slim. Yet, for reasons no one could articulate, the scene still didn't align with the classic pattern of an accidental drowning. Everything felt suspended between logic and something no one wanted to say out loud. Divers from the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency were the first to voice concern about the water itself. Harpeth Bend Lake was not known for swallowing people whole. Its depth varied, but most areas near the dock were manageable, predictable, with gentle slopes and soft silt that typically gave way to visibility after only a few downward sweeps. Victims who slipped usually surfaced within a day or two. Clothing, shoes, fishing equipment, something always floated, always drifted toward the bank. But this time, nothing did. There were no bubbles, no drag marks, no clothing fragments tangled in reeds. It was as if the lake had remained untouched. When divers descended again that afternoon, the turbulence from the previous day's storms had cleared slightly. The team swept along the support beams beneath the dock and ventured into deeper pockets toward the center basin. They found debris from storms past, sunken branches, a rusted bicycle frame, and an old tire half buried in sediment. But they did not find a person, they did not find equipment, and they did not find the second life jacket. One diver surfaced and quietly told the sheriff, "If they went into this water, we should have hit something by now." That statement would be repeated in interviews, reports, and late-night discussions between investigators for months. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was the first technical indicator that the accident theory had cracks in its foundation. As the physical search expanded, another kind of search began. One that moved through the quieter spaces of people's memories, rumors, and the kind of small-town observations that often reveal more than they intend. Investigators began interviewing neighbors, family friends, and anyone who had seen Mark or Tyler in the days leading up to the trip. Most people described the same father and son everyone knew: steady, close-knit, reliable. But then, a coworker at the mill mentioned something unusual. The day before the trip, he claimed Mark had received a phone call during lunch that left him visibly shaken. When pressed about it, Mark brushed it off, saying it was just something he'd deal with later. The coworker didn't think much of it at the time, but now, with the disappearance making headlines, the detail suddenly felt relevant. Investigators pulled Mark's phone records, only to find that the incoming number had been disconnected months earlier. No name associated, no address, no clear link to anything. Another neighbor recalled hearing raised voices coming from the Ellison home earlier in the week, but when investigators asked Angela about it, she explained it was a minor disagreement about finances, nothing worth connecting to a disappearance. And still, the detail lingered, not because it pointed to foul play, but because the case had begun to starve for clarity. Every scrap of information became something to analyze, something to question, something to hold up to the light in hopes that it refracted into a recognizable pattern. The most puzzling discovery came from a school notebook found in Tyler's bedroom. It contained a short, incomplete sentence written in shaky handwriting. "I hope he doesn't get mad at me again." The notebook wasn't dated, and the sentence wasn't directed at anyone specifically. Angela insisted it referred to a disagreement over forgotten homework. The school counselor agreed. But investigators couldn't help noticing how the sentence served as an open window into a child's worry, something that made them reconsider every possibility, even the ones no one wanted to voice. For a brief moment, speculation drifted toward domestic strife. Investigators reviewed medical records, school performance, and any sign of family instability. They found none. As the days rolled into weeks, leads rose and fell like shallow waves. One man at a nearby marina insisted he'd seen a suspicious truck parked near the dock the afternoon the Ellisons vanished, but he couldn't recall the color or model. Another person claimed they heard a boat engine rev during the storm, but admitted they couldn't be sure if it was that day or the previous afternoon. A retired angler who frequented the lake nearly every week told deputies that the water levels near Harpeth Bend had been behaving strangely recently. Stronger undercurrents than usual, odd backflows, shifts in temperature pockets that didn't match seasonal norms. But again, nothing that pointed directly to the Ellisons. It wasn't long before rumors began to sprout. Some thought Mark had taken his son and left town intentionally. Others whispered that he owed someone money. A few believed that something darker happened at the dock, something someone was hiding. In a community of barely 5,000 people, speculation moved fast, often outrunning facts and leaving families caught in the undertow. The sheriff's office attempted to keep the investigation grounded. They conducted a thorough search of Mark's finances and digital records. No hidden accounts, no sudden withdrawals, no sign of planning. His employment file showed consistency. His relationships were stable. His vehicle registration was up to date. He had bought a new cooler just 2 days before the trip, a detail that felt oddly cruel to his wife when she learned it from investigators. Meanwhile, the lake continued to defy expectations. Wildlife officers visited Angela personally to explain the water dynamics. They described how temperature layers affected buoyancy, how silt could temporarily obscure objects, and how certain types of debris could trap a victim underwater. But even they admitted that these conditions rarely held someone down for long. A body, they said, almost always surfaced, usually within 72 hours. 72 hours came and went. Nothing surfaced. By early June, the official classification shifted to presumed drowning. It was the closest authorities could come to labeling the event without solving it. But behind closed doors, some investigators privately admitted that the evidence supporting that classification was thinner than they had ever felt comfortable with. One deputy later recalled that the Ellison case never sat right, adding that he could never shake the feeling that they were missing something too obvious to dismiss. Search teams scaled back by the end of the first month. Drone scans of the shoreline revealed nothing unusual. Sniffer dogs alerted only to areas that had already been searched thoroughly. Every trail led nowhere. Every clue dissolved. Every theory contradicted another. The emotional strain on the family grew unbearable. Angela alternated between numb silence and frantic bursts of searching on her own, walking the shoreline while calling her son's name as if repetition alone could pull him back. Family members tried to shield her from the mounting theories, the whispers, the headline-driven speculation. But in a town this small, avoidance was impossible. Every store aisle, every church pew, every mailbox carried some reminder of the loss. And still, the dock remained painfully unchanged. The same railing, the same boards that creaked, the same quiet slope into the water. Someone tied 2 ribbons, one blue, one white, to one of the support posts. They whipped softly in the breeze each day, frayed by weather, fading slowly. One thing everyone agreed on was this: whatever happened to Mark and Tyler, it happened fast. There was no drawn-out struggle, no sign of drifting, no evidence of a staged disappearance. It was as if they walked onto that dock and stepped into a moment that simply erased them. In the summer heat, investigators revisited every documented drowning in the county's history. They found only 2 cases with full-body disappearances, and both were eventually resolved within a matter of days. The Ellison case exceeded all previous timelines, all known water behavior patterns, all expectations. Months passed. The search was no longer active. Investigators moved on to other cases. The Ellison file was placed into a box and slid into an evidence room shelf. It didn't gather dust exactly. It was opened periodically as new deputies joined the force, read, discussed, puzzled over, and then closed again. But little by little, the urgency faded. The story settled into something colder, harder, a kind of unsolved ache that clung to the community even when people didn't talk about it anymore. Still, certain details continued to gnaw at those who had worked the case. The unexplained phone call, the missing life jacket, the untouched cooler, the crookedly parked truck, the diver's remark about the unnatural stillness of the water. Each piece hovered just short of revealing anything meaningful. They were fragments of a puzzle without edges. By late summer, one investigator wrote in a private memo that he believed foul play could not be ruled out. But with no evidence, no witnesses, and no physical recovery, it remained speculation. The memo was archived, unread for years. In the absence of closure, the story began to twist into local lore. People said the lake was cursed. Others joked nervously about whirlpools and sinkholes. A few avoided the dock entirely. Most just let the silence settle, because silence was easier than confronting a mystery with no direction. Yet the strange thing, the detail nearly every investigator circled back to years later, was how calm the initial scene had been. No overturned chairs, no broken boards, no signs of panic. It was the kind of calm that felt unnatural, as though whatever had happened had occurred beneath the surface, hidden from sight. And while the lake gave no answers in 2007, something else had begun forming, quietly, slowly, in the minds of rescuers, deputies, and locals. A sense that the water was holding something, not forever, but long enough to confuse the present and complicate the truth. It would take more than a decade to discover what that something was. And when it finally surfaced, the entire county would realize that the simple theories, the whispered rumors, and the official reports had all overlooked the one place investigators never thought to search deeply enough, the space directly beneath their feet. For most of Stewart County, the disappearance of Mark and his son slowly drifted out of daily conversation as the months rolled into years. But for Angela Ellison, time did not move forward in any normal sense. It only stretched, long, thin, and painfully quiet. Her home still held their shoes by the door, their jackets on the hooks, the half-filled notebook on the kitchen counter, where Tyler had been practicing vocabulary words the week before they vanished. She didn't pack any of it away. She couldn't. Those small objects were the only proof that her family had existed in the same room with her, that they had once belonged to a life that now felt paused mid-breath. In 2008, the sheriff's office officially moved the Ellison file into the evidence room, labeling it inactive. The box sat on the third shelf, tucked between a burglary case from the late 90s and a 2-inch binder from a forgotten investigation involving an off-the-books moonshine still. Every deputy knew where it was. Most of them had glanced at it at some point, either out of curiosity or discomfort, but no one opened it with intent. The case had no leads, no suspects, no physical evidence. It was a story without a middle or an end, only a beginning that didn't make sense. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, Angela mailed a letter to the sheriff's office. Sometimes it was short, a paragraph asking if anything had changed. Other times, it was pages long, filled with memories of her husband and son, snapshots of their lives she didn't want anyone to forget. She always ended with the same line: "If there is anything at all, please tell me." And every year, the sheriff or his deputy wrote back with the same honest truth. Nothing new, no progress, no answers. Yet she kept writing. The letters became her ritual, her way of refusing to let her family slip beneath the weight of silence. The town eventually developed its own theories. Some believed Mark had taken Tyler and run away, though no one could explain why a man with no debts, no conflicts, and no criminal history would abandon his entire life. Others whispered darker stories in hushed voices. Rumors of an argument, a moment of rage, a mistake that spiraled into something irreversible. A few clung to the idea that the lake held something unnatural, that the water behaved differently around the dock, though no one said that part publicly. It lingered in the air like something that shouldn't be acknowledged. In 2009, a hunter claimed he'd seen an unusual light near the shoreline around midnight while walking back from a deer stand. He described it as faint, like the glow of submerged headlights. But he admitted he'd been drinking that evening and couldn't say for certain if the light was real or imagined. When deputies drove out the next morning, they found nothing. No tire tracks, no boat markings, no indication anyone had been near the dock. The report was filed away as an odd but unconfirmed observation, the kind that happens often enough in rural investigations, but rarely leads anywhere meaningful. That same year, one of the original deputies assigned to the Ellison case retired. He kept a personal copy of the case notes, the parts he was legally allowed to retain, and took them home, storing them in a drawer that also held mementos from the hardest cases he had ever worked. In later interviews, he said he believed the Ellison case was the only one that ever truly stayed with him, the only one he could never categorize as accident, crime, or anything at all. It simply defied explanation. When he retired, the case shifted to younger deputies, some of whom hadn't lived in Stewart County long enough to understand the emotional weight it carried. In 2011, a drought lowered Harpeth Bend Lake to its lowest level in over 20 years. The shoreline receded by nearly 6 feet, exposing roots, stones, and small fragments of old fishing equipment embedded in mud. Deputies revisited the dock, walking the cracked terrain with quiet hope. It was the first natural opportunity in 4 years to see what the lake might reveal. They scanned the exposed sections, poked through the newly visible sediment, and checked beneath logs and brush piles. But again, the search ended the same way. Nothing from the Ellisons, not a belt buckle, not a shoe sole, not a fishing lure. The lake remained indifferent, That drought prompted renewed conversations inside the sheriff's office about reopening the investigation. But without new evidence, no one could justify the manpower. The file went back to the shelf. The box grew a little softer at the edges from humidity and handling, the ink on the label fading just slightly. But it stayed there. It always stayed there. When technology advanced in the mid-2010s, new side scans, sonar, high-resolution imaging drones, 3D mapping software, some deputies privately wondered if those tools might finally show what earlier equipment simply couldn't. But budgets were tight, and the case was inactive. No one requested a new survey of the lake. The dock remained standing, weathered, repaired, once in 2012 after a storm damaged the railing, but otherwise unchanged. Anyone walking across it would have no idea that the boards beneath their feet had once been the center of a county-wide mystery. Angela kept walking the dock, though. Every few months she returned, standing at the end where Mark and Tyler had likely cast their lines. Sometimes she brought flowers. Sometimes she just stood there quietly, letting the wind move through her hair. Locals who saw her never approached. They understood there were no words that could soften what she carried. In 2015, heavy spring flooding raised water levels unusually high, then dropped them suddenly as the spillway gates were adjusted. Deputies again took the opportunity to walk the perimeter, scanning areas that had been underwater for decades. They found aluminum cans, pieces of fishing line, the remains of an old wooden oar. They found nothing belonging to the Ellisons. The search, though brief, reopened old wounds in the community. It reminded everyone that the case had never gone anywhere. It had simply gone quiet. Meanwhile, investigators who had once spent sleepless nights combing through theories moved into other roles. Some transferred to state agencies, some retired, some left law enforcement entirely. As staff changed, the Ellison disappearance became more of a historical mystery than an active piece of someone's workload. New deputies heard about it during training or in offhand conversations. Most reacted with the same puzzled expression: a father and son vanish on a calm lake, without witnesses, without evidence, and without recovery. It didn't fit any known pattern. Between 2016 and 2017, the case was reviewed twice. Once by a newly appointed investigator who liked to challenge old files, and once after a citizen delivered an anonymous tip claiming the pair had been seen in Alabama years after the disappearance. Both reviews led nowhere. The Alabama sighting was quickly disproven. The investigators' review ended with a note stating that, without physical evidence, the case does not present actionable investigative direction. But beneath all the silence, beneath the passing years and fading theories, one quiet truth lingered in nearly every mind that had ever worked the case. The lake had not given up its answers. Not in 2007, not in 2008, not in 2011, not in 2015. The water had simply remained still, offering no sign that anything unusual had ever taken place. And yet, there was always that small, unshakable feeling, whispered sometimes by deputies, admitted once by Angela, repeated quietly by those who stood long enough on the dock to feel it, a sense that something was still down there, something they hadn't found, something that had stayed hidden, not because it was far away, but because it was closer than anyone imagined. It would take a decade, and one diver with a habit of revisiting forgotten mysteries, to discover just how close it had been all along. Every case on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. Each episode takes nearly 15 days of research and long nights chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, please take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going. And if you want to watch more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. By 2018, more than a decade had passed since the disappearance of Mark and Tyler Ellison, and most people in Stewart County believed the case had settled permanently into the category of tragic, unresolvable mysteries. But for one person, the story never quieted. It had been part of his life since childhood, woven into conversations at school, whispered during fishing trips, retold in gas station aisles and barbershop chairs until it felt less like a story and more like a haunting reminder of how people could simply vanish without a trace. His name was Evan Rudd. He was 29 years old, a volunteer rescue diver who spent most of his free time training in lakes and rivers across Tennessee. He had learned to dive as a teenager after helping with a search for a classmate who drowned during a summer accident. Something about the work stayed with him, not the danger, but the responsibility. The unspoken weight of being the person who went into the water when everyone else had stepped back, hoping for clarity, where others found only fear. By adulthood, Evan was known as someone who didn't let unresolved endings go easily. He remembered the Ellison case vividly. He had been 12 when it happened, the same age Tyler had been. He remembered seeing the missing posters taped to grocery store windows. He remembered the long silences in town whenever the case came up, and how adults spoke in lowered voices, as if afraid the lake itself might overhear. Over the years, he revisited the details on his own. Newspaper archives, rumors, old reports. He wasn't related to the family, he had never met them. But something about the father and son disappearance had always felt personal, maybe because it happened in a place he knew. Maybe because he could never understand how a lake could swallow two people and keep their secrets for more than a decade. In 2018, technology had changed. Sonar imaging was sharper, deeper, more precise. Rescue divers across the country were using equipment that would have been unthinkable in 2007. And when Evan received a small grant for volunteer search programs, he didn't hesitate. He bought a high-resolution side-scan sonar device, a tool that could map underwater landscapes with astonishing clarity. The first place he wanted to test it was Harpeth Bend. He approached deputies with the idea, expecting skepticism. Instead, they listened. The Ellison disappearance had never faded from their internal memory, even if it had vanished from their workload. Some of the younger deputies had grown up hearing about the case the same way Evan had. Some were new to the county and had only learned of it through archive files. All of them knew, however, that technology had evolved, so when Evan offered to rescan the lake at no cost under supervision, they agreed to let him try. The first sweep took place on a quiet morning in early April. The lake was calm, glass-like, barely disturbed by the hum of Evan's small aluminum boat. He moved slowly, deliberately, passing over the same paths divers had mapped years earlier. At first, the sonar screen showed exactly what he expected: fallen limbs, sediment ridges, old debris scattered across the bottom. But as he edged closer to the marina dock, he noticed an area the earlier teams had never mapped thoroughly. A section of collapsed support beams and twisted wood created a kind of shadowed blind spot under the dock's far corner. It wasn't unusual for sonar to struggle beneath heavy structure, but when he steered closer, something flickered across the screen, a shape that didn't match anything natural, rectangular, solid, too defined to be driftwood, too uniform to be rock. He backed the boat up and scanned again. The shape remained, buried deep beneath silt, partially obscured, but unmistakably manufactured. He called the supervising deputy over. The deputy stared at the display, brows tightening as the outline sharpened with each pass. It wasn't clear enough to identify, but it was coherent enough to provoke a sudden, heavy silence between them. After a moment, the deputy exhaled. He didn't say what both men were thinking, but he didn't need to. The possibility hung between them like a weight. Even with the surprising sonar hit, protocol required caution. Before any dive could be authorized, the sheriff reviewed the scans and consulted with state experts. Most agreed the anomaly was worth examining. A rectangular mass with metallic echo signatures buried directly beneath the original dock structure was not something that should have gone unnoticed in 2007. But the collapsed beams, storm damage, and outdated equipment from that era made it plausible that earlier teams had missed it. A supervised dive was scheduled for later that week. Evan hardly slept the night before. He kept replaying the sonar image in his mind, analyzing each line and shadow, until his thoughts spiraled into something close to obsession. He wasn't hoping for tragedy, not consciously, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that the lake had been holding something back all these years, something people had been searching for on the wrong side of the dock. The water that morning was cold and murky, stirred by wind sweeping in from the hills. Deputies stood on the dock, radios clipped to their shoulders, watching as Evan suited up, adjusting straps and checking gauges with mechanical precision. He lowered himself into the water slowly, letting the chill settle around his body. Once beneath the surface, the noise of the world dimmed until only the sound of his breath remained. Visibility dropped almost instantly. The deeper he went, the darker everything became, thick clouds of silt rising with each movement. The collapsed beams created a maze of wooden limbs that snagged at his gear. He had to maneuver carefully, pulling himself inch by inch through narrow pockets of space. More than once he felt something brush against his leg or arm, only to realize it was a submerged branch or a piece of debris shifting with the current. He reached the approximate sonar location and began sweeping the area with his gloved hands. The ground was soft, uneven. Layers of silt clung to everything. He moved cautiously, feeling for any surface that wasn't organic. But as minutes passed, the visibility worsened. Debris drifted downward, tangling around his equipment. A branch caught on his tank strap, pulling him sideways into a cluster of splintered timber. His regulator scraped against wood as he struggled free. The supervising deputy, monitoring the situation from above, noticed the disturbance in Evan's airline and ordered him to surface. Reluctantly, Evan complied. When he climbed back onto the dock, soaked and shaken, he knew he had been dangerously close to becoming trapped. The first attempt was deemed inconclusive. The sheriff insisted on caution. No discovery was worth risking a diver's life. But the anomaly on the sonar remained unexplained, and Evan refused to walk away. He spent the next 2 days studying the structure of the old dock, measuring angles, reviewing historical photos of the marina before the storm damage. He envisioned exactly where the collapse would have hidden anything beneath it, and with every detail he uncovered, the same conclusion kept forming in his mind. They had missed something in 2007, something big. A second dive was approved with strict conditions. More deputies were stationed at the dock. Additional safety lines were secured. Evan was instructed to abort at the first sign of entanglement. Yet even with all the precautions, he felt the same tension in his chest as he descended again. Like the moment before stepping into a room you've imagined 1,000 times but never entered. The water felt colder this time, the silt heavier. He moved slowly, careful not to disturb the debris. When he reached the zone again, he paused, hovering above the lake bed. He extended his hand, brushing aside clumps of underwater moss. Then he felt it, a flat, rigid surface, smooth beneath layers of corrosion. Not wood, not stone, metal. His heart pounded as he cleared more silt, exposing a slight curve. It felt like the top of a roof, a vehicle roof. He traced the edge until his fingers caught on what felt like the lip of a window frame. His breath quickened. The truth washed over him in a jolt that almost made him drop his flashlight. A pickup truck was buried beneath the dock. He surfaced quickly, shouting through his regulator as soon as he broke into open air. Deputies ran to the edge, seeing the urgency in his eyes before he even spoke. He pulled himself onto the dock, tearing off his mask, gasping as he tried to find the words. But he didn't need many. His expression told them everything. The lake had never taken the Ellisons far. They had been right there the entire time, waiting beneath the dock, buried under wood and silt and 11 years of uncertainty. And as deputies radioed for forensic teams and recovery crews, Evan stood trembling on the dock, still feeling the cold metal beneath his glove. He didn't know what they would find inside that truck, but he knew this discovery would finally unravel the mystery that had defined a decade of silence. And he knew, as the sheriff arrived with a stunned look on his face, that the recovery would reveal more than a vehicle. It would reveal the truth at last. By the time recovery crews arrived at Harpeth Bend, word had already spread across Stewart County that something significant had been discovered beneath the old dock. People gathered quietly along the shoreline, neighbors, former classmates of Tyler, men who'd worked alongside Mark, even strangers who had only heard stories of the disappearance. There was no shouting or excitement, only a heavy collective silence, the kind that hangs over a community waiting for answers they aren't sure they're ready to receive. Deputies sectioned off the dock and coordinated with a specialized marine recovery team brought in from Nashville. They used inflatable lift bags, steel cables, and a mechanical winch strong enough to haul thousands of pounds from the lake bed. The sheriff stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the water, as if trying to see through it. He had been a deputy in 2007. He remembered the night they searched until sunrise. He remembered the missing life jacket, the untouched cooler, the truck parked at that strange angle. Now he was seeing the case again, not as a theory, but as something finally taking physical shape. Divers re-entered the water first to secure the vehicle. They disappeared beneath the surface, their bubbles rising in slow, steady streams. Minutes later, one of them resurfaced, lifted his mask, and nodded. The cables were attached. The truck was ready to be lifted. When the winch engaged, the lake seemed to hold onto the vehicle like something unwilling to give up its secret. Mud and silt churned upward as the steel cables tightened. The water darkened around the dock, thickening into a cloudy vortex. People held their breath without realizing it, watching the ripples widen, watching the cables strain, watching the lake finally release something it had kept hidden for 11 long years. Slowly, the roof broke the surface. It was covered in moss and corrosion, barely recognizable beneath layers of lakebed debris. As the water drained off the metal, the shape of the cab emerged. The rear window was shattered inward. The passenger side window was intact, but opaque with mud. The truck bobbed once, then steadied as the lift bags were adjusted. What struck everyone immediately was the orientation of the vehicle. It was upright, nose angled slightly downward, wedged between two collapsed beams that had pinned it to the bottom. It hadn't drifted, it hadn't rolled. It had gone straight down and stayed there, pressed beneath the skeleton of the dock like something entombed. When the recovery team maneuvered the truck onto the bank, a hush swept over the crowd. Deputies instructed people to step back, but no one had moved forward anyway. They remained still, faces pale, eyes fixed on the mud-packed windows as the forensic team approached with quiet, practiced movements. The first door that opened was the driver's side. The smell of silt and decay escaped into the air like a soft, dull wave. Inside the cab, packed so tightly with sediment it looked more like a burial chamber than a vehicle, investigators found exactly what they feared and what Angela had hoped for years not to imagine. Mark Ellison was still in the driver's seat. His skeletal hands rested on the steering wheel, frozen at a twisted angle that suggested a violent, abrupt impact. His seatbelt remained strapped across his torso, buckled the same way he always wore it while driving. Mud had filled the space around him, encasing his legs and shoulders. The posture hit everyone who saw it with a painful clarity. He had been alive when the truck entered the water. He had been trying to regain control. On the passenger side, buried deeper in sediment, was Tyler. His small frame was partially collapsed forward, seatbelt still across his chest. His backpack, blue with a faded patch of a baseball stitched on the front, lay crumpled near the floorboard, half submerged in mud. The sight of it struck a deputy so hard he had to turn away and steady his breathing. For years, that backpack had been described in search bulletins. People had imagined it hanging from a tree somewhere in the woods, floating near the shoreline, lying on a riverbank. But it had been here the whole time, sealed in a sunken cab no one ever thought to search beneath. Forensic specialists worked meticulously, documenting every angle, every fragment of cloth, every rusted metal component. They spoke quietly, their words clipped, their expressions unreadable, but their movements conveyed the same thing. This was not the aftermath of foul play. This was the aftermath of physics, mechanics, and terrible timing. Within hours, the preliminary assessment revealed what had happened. The tie rod, a critical part of the steering mechanism, had snapped. Corrosion had eaten away at it until the metal fractured under pressure. When it gave out, the steering wheel would have jerked violently, pulling the truck sharply to one side. If Mark had been turning near the dock's edge, the failure could have happened in the worst possible moment. He would have lost control instantly. The truck would have lurched forward, broken through the weakened section of dock, and dropped straight into the lake. The speed of the descent explained everything. There would have been no time to react, no window to unbuckle, no chance to reach for a door handle. Experts explained that the water pressure around a rapidly sinking vehicle can pin occupants in place, trapping them in seconds. And when the truck hit the bottom, collapsing beams from the dock had fallen over it, creating a cage of wood and debris that hid the vehicle from divers and sonar for more than a decade. The state forensic engineer said the conditions in 2007 made detection nearly impossible. Sonar used at the time had been basic. The collapsed beams distorted signals, creating blind spots. The silt layer over the roof grew thicker each year, burying the truck deeper. Every environmental change, from drought to flooding, only reinforced the concealment. Why had the life jacket been missing? Because it was never used. It had likely been tossed or dropped during the commotion of the impact, possibly sliding out of the cab as the vehicle shifted underwater. Where were the fishing rods, the tackle, the gear? Still inside the bed or scattered on the dock? All irrelevant to the cause, all overshadowed by the central truth. A mechanical failure had triggered a silent catastrophe. When investigators informed Angela, she received the news sitting at her dining table, the same place she had eaten breakfast with her husband and son on the morning they disappeared. Deputies described her reaction afterward not as shock, but as something deeper, heavier, the kind of pain that collapses quietly instead of bursting outward. She had spent 11 years trapped between hope and dread, imagining countless outcomes. But she had never imagined this. Not the simplicity of it, not the speed, not the unpreventable chain of events that had stolen her family without warning. She asked only one question: were they alone? And when the deputies assured her they were, that there was no sign of another vehicle, no second set of tire marks, no defensive wounds, no evidence of struggle, she closed her eyes, exhaled, and nodded. It was the closest she could come to peace. At the recovery site, investigators continued their analysis long after the crowds dispersed. A few deputies lingered beside the truck, staring at the twisted steering mechanism. One of them, a man who had searched the lake in 2007, remarked softly that they had walked over that dock dozens of times, calling out for Mark and Tyler, without realizing the two were just feet beneath them. The admission carried no blame, only the heavy acknowledgement of hindsight, one that every investigator would carry for the rest of their careers. The sheriff signed off on the final classification: accidental drowning due to mechanical failure. It was the most accurate, most honest conclusion the evidence supported. No crime, no violence, no mystery born from human intent. Just a catastrophic mechanical collapse paired with the perfect and tragic environmental circumstances to hide it. But even with the truth secured, the case did not feel neatly resolved. Not emotionally, not for the community, not for Angela, not for the deputies who had stood on that dock night after night, wondering how two people could vanish so completely. The truth offered closure, yes, but it also forced everyone to confront a painful reality. The lake had always held the answer. They had simply never looked beneath the right place. And as the recovery crew prepared to transport the truck for final processing, Evan stood alone near the shoreline, staring at the damp depression in the soil where the vehicle had rested. He felt no triumph, only a somber recognition of what the lake had kept hidden and what it had finally returned. He didn't know yet what the county would do to honor the Ellisons. He didn't know how Angela would navigate life after receiving the confirmation she had feared and needed in equal measure. He only knew that the truth had finally surfaced, and that tomorrow the community would gather again, not to search, but to mourn. In the days following the recovery, a quiet stillness settled over Stewart County, the kind that comes after a long-awaited answer, but brings no comfort with it. The Ellison case, once a mystery people whispered about, once a source of speculation and painful theories, was now no longer unknown. The truth lay in a truck pulled from the water, in the twisted metal of a steering mechanism that had failed in a single catastrophic moment, and in the remains of a father and son who never had a chance to react. But answers do not erase grief, and they do not soften the years that came before them. The sheriff's office released an official statement confirming the cause of the accident, explaining the mechanical failure, and publicly acknowledging that the truck's position beneath the collapsed dock structure had concealed it from every search effort. They emphasized that nothing suggested foul play. No one had been involved but the lake, the truck, and an unforeseeable sequence of events. Most residents accepted the explanation, though quietly, many admitted they wished the truth felt less senseless. It was difficult to reconcile 11 years of heartbreak with something as mechanical as a broken tie rod. The memorial service was held 3 days later near the rebuilt section of the dock. Hundreds of people attended, far more than Angela expected. Some came because they remembered searching the shoreline in 2007. Some came because they had always wondered what happened. Others came because they knew that when a story like this finally ends, a community needs to stand together to acknowledge it. The ceremony wasn't elaborate. There were no grand speeches, just the steady weaving of memories spoken softly. Mark teaching neighborhood kids how to tie fishing knots, Tyler laughing on his bike, Angela sharing how her husband never missed a school event if he could help it. A pastor read a short reflection, something about closure not being an ending, but a place to rest. People nodded even if the sentiment didn't fully land. Closure was complicated here. The truth had brought finality, yes, but it had also reopened years of questions. Why the failure happened at that exact moment? Why the dock had collapsed in just the right way to hide the truck? Why the lake had kept silent for so long? These weren't questions science could answer. They were part of the emotional residue that follows unresolved grief, even after resolution arrives. As the service ended, deputies escorted Angela to a small, white box containing items recovered from the truck, her son's backpack, damaged but recognizable, the key ring Mark always carried, still covered in silt, fragments of clothing that had survived the years underwater. She held them carefully, as if afraid they would disappear again. A deputy who'd searched the lake back in 2007 later said he'd never forget the look in her eyes. It wasn't shock, it wasn't the raw devastation of a new loss. It was the quiet exhaustion of someone who had lived in uncertainty for so long that even the truth felt unreal. In the days that followed, forensic teams finished their analysis. They reconstructed the likely sequence of the accident: the tie rod snapping, the sudden pull of the steering wheel, the momentum carrying the truck over the edge of the dock, the immediate plunge into deep water. They confirmed that the wooden beams collapsing over the truck had acted like camouflage, deflecting sonar and physically shielding the vehicle from divers. It was an alignment of circumstances so specific that even the investigators struggled to categorize it. Not improbable, but incredibly, painfully rare. Inside the sheriff's office, discussions turned inward. A few deputies wondered aloud whether the case should have been reopened sooner, whether more advanced equipment should have been used before 2018, whether something obvious had been missed. But the truth was that the state of search technology in 2007 simply wasn't capable of seeing through the layers of debris that covered the vehicle. Earlier teams had operated with the tools they had. They had searched thoroughly, repeatedly, and with genuine intent. The failure wasn't negligence, it was limitation. And yet, the knowledge didn't ease the ache of hindsight. For Evan, the reality of what he'd found took time to settle. He returned to the lake often in the weeks after the recovery, sometimes sitting on the dock, sometimes walking its edge. He didn't talk about the discovery publicly. He didn't want recognition or praise. What stayed with him wasn't the accomplishment, but the moment underwater when his glove brushed metal. The jolt of knowing he had found something that people had been searching for longer than he'd been an adult. He carried that moment the way divers carry the memory of their hardest searches, quietly, respectfully, with a weight that never fully lifts. The community gradually returned to its rhythms, but something subtle had shifted. The lake was no longer a place defined by mystery. It was a place defined by memory. People who fished at Harpeth Bend began speaking more softly. Parents held their children closer near the water's edge. Even the wind seemed different, as if it carried a story now instead of a question. Angela began sorting through the recovered belongings at her own pace. She didn't rush. She didn't force anything. Grief had taught her patience. She found comfort in small things. Placing Mark's keys in a drawer, folding what remained of Tyler's backpack straps, framing a photograph of the two together on a fishing trip years before the accident. She told a close friend that the truth didn't erase the years of pain, but it finally let her breathe without wondering. That was all she had wanted. As winter approached, the sheriff ordered the remaining parts of the collapsed dock structure removed permanently, replacing them with reinforced supports. During the construction, workers found pieces of splintered timber that matched the impact patterns described by forensic engineers. The discovery validated the accident reconstruction, proving that the truck had broken through exactly where the dock had already weakened. It was small confirmation, but meaningful. It sealed the narrative in a way nothing else could. In December, the sheriff placed the final Ellison report into the archives, noting the cause of death as accidental drowning due to mechanical failure. The file, once a symbol of uncertainty, now held a completed timeline. Yet the emotional truth of the case lived outside paper, carried in the memories of those who searched, those who waited, and those who never stopped hoping for answers. On the last evening of the year, Evan stood on the dock one more time, watching the lake ripple under a fading sky. He thought about how close the truck had been to where he stood, just feet below, hidden in plain sight. He thought about the years of silence, the countless unanswered questions, the families who never received clarity. And he understood that this case, now resolved, was a rare gift in a world where many stories never find their ending. He took a long breath, steady and quiet, as the wind moved across the water. The lake looked peaceful again. But he knew it would never be just a lake to him. Not after what it had held, not after what it had finally returned. And as he stepped away, the last traces of sunlight slipping behind the hills, the only sound was the soft movement of water, no longer hiding anything, no longer silent, simply existing in the place where a mystery had finally come home.